No one on the frozen shoreline could explain why Ethan Hale's last morning began like a love story, and ended like a riddle. Ethan was the kind of man people trusted on instinct. In his late 60s, he still woke before sunrise, still kept his tools lined up in the garage like soldiers, still believed that a promise meant something. He'd spent a lifetime earning a reputation that was almost old-fashioned, disciplined, dependable, quietly generous. When neighbors needed a hand with a fence or a gutter, Ethan was the one who showed up without being asked, sleeves rolled, jaw set, ready to work. After his first marriage ended, friends said he'd likely stay alone. Ethan didn't seem lonely, just cautious. He had grown children who adored him, a steady routine, and a calm confidence that made him feel unshakable. So when he met Claire Hale, people were surprised, and then quickly convinced it made sense. Claire was warm in public in a way that made cameras love her. She spoke at community events, chaired fundraisers, and posed beside oversized donation checks with a practiced smile. She ran a nonprofit that sounded like the definition of goodness, helping families, supporting local programs, lifting the community, as she liked to say. She had 2 adult daughters, Megan and Sophie, and when Claire married Ethan, it looked like a blending of 2 neat, successful lives. From the outside, it was picture perfect. Inside the house, the marriage had its own weather, bright days, sudden cold fronts, long stretches of silence. Ethan didn't talk much about private matters. But he did mention, once or twice, that Claire could be particular. That she worried about appearances. That she hated loose ends. Still, in public she was radiant. And Ethan, standing beside her, looked steady and proud, like a man who'd finally found a second chance that didn't ask him to change who he was. What almost no one knew was that Claire's nonprofit wasn't just her passion. It was her pipeline. Over the years, money began to vanish in ways that were easy to hide if you controlled the paperwork. Payments that didn't match invoices. Transfers that didn't match projects. A neat maze of shell companies, names that sounded legitimate, addresses that led nowhere important, accounts that existed only long enough to swallow funds and pass them along. And threaded through it all were 2 names that shouldn't have been there at all, her daughters. Claire had built the whole thing like a stage set, bright lights, good angles, applause on cue. She understood that admiration was a kind of protection. The more people praised her, the less they questioned her. And Ethan, with his clean reputation and solid presence, made the image even stronger. But images don't last forever. The first tremor came as whispers, auditors asking for clarification, a bank flagging unusual activity, a board member noticing that numbers weren't lining up. Then the questions grew sharper. Emails turned urgent. Meetings became tense. And somewhere beyond the small circle of the nonprofit, unseen doors opened, the kind that don't close once they swing wide. Ethan sensed something was wrong before he understood what it was. He noticed Claire's late-night pacing, her phone pressed to her ear in the laundry room with the door shut. He heard the way her voice changed when she thought no one was listening, tight, clipped, almost furious. He watched her laugh too loudly at dinner parties, the laugh arriving a half-second too late, like a performance she had to force into place. One evening, Ethan mentioned he hadn't been feeling well. "It's nothing," he said, rubbing his stomach as he stared at his plate. "Just, off." Claire didn't ask many questions. She simply nodded, got up, and returned with a glass of water like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan drank it because he trusted her. And because men like Ethan Hale, men who've spent a lifetime doing the right thing, tend to believe the people closest to them are doing the same. Outside, February crept in with brittle cold. The lake near their town hardened at the edges, dark water shifting under thin sheets of ice. And as Valentine's Day approached, Claire suggested something simple, something romantic. An early morning boat ride. Just the 2 of them. Ethan hesitated. It was the kind of cold that burned the lungs. But Claire insisted, smiling the way she did when she wanted something decided. So Ethan agreed. And somewhere in the quiet space between that agreement and the dawn that followed, Claire's carefully managed life began to tilt toward the edge. The morning of the boat trip arrived wrapped in silence. It was still dark when Ethan stepped outside, the cold biting through his coat as if it had teeth. The lake lay ahead of them, black and glassy, steam lifting from its surface like breath. February air carried a sharp, metallic smell, and every sound, boots on gravel, the clink of keys, felt too loud for the hour. Claire was already awake. Perfectly awake. She stood by the dock with her arms folded, hair pulled back neatly, expression calm but focused. She had packed the supplies herself. Thermos. Blankets. Life jackets laid out with care. It looked thoughtful. Organized. Loving. Ethan smiled at her, though he felt strangely tired. He hadn't slept well. His stomach had twisted through the night, a deep, uncomfortable unease that came and went in waves. He told himself it was nerves, or age, or the cold. He didn't want to start the day complaining. They pushed off just as the sky began to lighten, the boat cutting a quiet line through the water. The motor hummed steadily, echoing across the lake. Claire sat stiffly, gloved hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed ahead. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "I'm fine," she replied quickly. "Just cold." They didn't talk much after that. The lake seemed to swallow words before they could land. Ethan felt dizzy now, the horizon shifting in a way that made him blink hard. He gripped the side of the boat, his fingers numb, his breath shallow. Then something changed. Claire later said the motor sputtered. That it coughed and died without warning. That she stood up to check it, and Ethan stood too, unsteady. According to her, the boat rocked just enough, just one wrong movement, and he was gone. She said she watched him fall. The water took him instantly. What happened next would become the most disputed hours of the case. Claire did not call for help right away. She did not scream, or flag another boat, or dial emergency services as the shock was still fresh. Instead, she sat there. Alone. On a drifting boat. In sub-freezing air. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. She later claimed her phone had died. That she was panicking. That she didn't know what to do. That the cold had numbed her mind as much as her hands. When she finally did make the call, her voice was controlled. Upset, yes, but measured. She told responders that her husband had fallen into the lake and hadn't resurfaced. She followed instructions carefully. Too carefully, some thought later. Like someone reading from a script. Search crews arrived quickly, but the water was unforgiving. The cold preserved and concealed. The lake gave nothing back that day. News spread fast. Ethan Hale, steady, reliable Ethan, missing beneath the ice. Claire became the grieving wife in public view. She cried on cue. She leaned into volunteers. She thanked first responders again and again. Cameras captured her wrapped in blankets, face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. She told friends she couldn't sleep. That the sound of the water replayed in her head. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. The same day Ethan disappeared, long-simmering financial questions broke into the open. Accounts tied to Claire's nonprofit were frozen. Records were requested, urgently. Board members were contacted by outside authorities. The timing was brutal, almost theatrical. And in the middle of it all, Claire began making changes. Estate documents were revised. Beneficiaries shifted. Signatures appeared that didn't quite match the man who supposedly signed them. A text message was sent from Ethan's phone, short, oddly phrased, using expressions he never used, telling one of his children that he'd be off the grid for a while. It didn't feel right. Weeks later, when the lake finally yielded Ethan's body, the relief was brief. Because the answers it carried were far worse than the questions that came before. The examination revealed something no one expected. There was no evidence that water had filled his lungs. No signs that the lake itself had taken him. Instead, the cause lay deeper, inside his system. A massive quantity of a common antihistamine. Far beyond any normal amount. Far beyond accident. As investigators began to rewind the story, back through the quiet dinners, the unexplained sickness, the careful planning, they realized the lake had not been the beginning. It had been the cover. And Claire Hale's perfect image began to crack, one detail at a time. The discovery changed everything. What had first looked like a tragic accident on cold water now carried a different weight, one that pressed heavily on every detail that came before it. Investigators no longer asked how Ethan ended up in the lake. They asked when his fate had truly been sealed. The antihistamine level in his system was staggering. Experts explained that no reasonable dosage, no mix-up, no forgetful double dose, could explain it. Taken in such quantity, it would have caused extreme drowsiness, confusion, loss of balance, and eventually organ failure. In simple terms, Ethan would have been barely able to stand, let alone react quickly to danger. Suddenly, the pieces began to slide into place. In the weeks before the boat trip, Ethan had complained to his children about feeling foggy. He said food tasted strange. That his limbs felt heavy at odd times of the day. Once, he joked that he felt like he was walking underwater. At the time, no one worried. Aging came with aches. Winter came with fatigue. Now those comments took on a darker meaning. Investigators searched the house. In the bathroom cabinet, they found an antihistamine bottle, nearly empty. The purchase date lined up neatly with Ethan's first complaints. Pharmacy records showed refills that didn't match seasonal allergies or normal use. Then came the digital trail. Claire's computer history revealed late-night searches, how long someone could survive in cold water, how currents moved beneath ice, whether medication could make a person lose balance. Individually, each search could be explained away. Together, they formed a picture that was hard to ignore. More troubling still were the financial records. As authorities dug deeper, the nonprofit unraveled. Funds had been redirected again and again through shell companies bearing innocent-sounding names. Those companies, in turn, were registered under Megan and Sophie, Claire's daughters, though evidence suggested they had little understanding of what their names were attached to. The timing was merciless. The same day Ethan vanished, outside agencies had begun coordinating their inquiries. Subpoenas were imminent. The spotlight Claire had worked so hard to control was about to turn harsh and unforgiving. And Ethan, dependable Ethan, stood directly in the way. The estate documents raised fresh alarms. A handwriting expert noted subtle inconsistencies. Pressure marks where a signature had been traced rather than written naturally. The changes funneled assets away from Ethan's children and toward Claire's side of the family. Then there was the text message. Sent from Ethan's phone after his disappearance, it used phrases he had never used in his life. Words that sounded like Claire. Polite. Formal. Carefully distant. It bought her time, just enough to move money, just enough to prepare explanations. When confronted, Claire's story shifted. First, the motor failure was sudden and complete. Then it was unreliable for weeks. First, Ethan insisted on standing. Then she said he lost his footing without warning. The 2-hour delay became confusion. Panic. Shock. Grief, she said, made her memory unreliable. But investigators saw something else: control. Every version minimized her responsibility while maximizing chaos. Every detail placed Ethan closer to danger and herself farther from it. As pressure mounted, Claire's public mask began to slip. The composed charity leader gave way to flashes of irritation. She corrected investigators unnecessarily. She bristled at routine questions. She insisted, too often, that she was being misunderstood. Meanwhile, Ethan's children sat across from each other in quiet rooms, absorbing the unthinkable. The woman their father trusted most might have been feeding him something that slowly took away his strength. Might have planned a moment when he couldn't fight back. Might have watched the clock while help stayed just out of reach. By the time authorities formally named Claire as a suspect, the lake no longer mattered. The truth had moved on land, into documents, devices, and decisions made long before dawn broke over the water. And with every new finding, the story grew less like an accident, and more like a carefully staged ending to a life that stood in the way. By the time Claire was taken into custody, the story she had built for years was already collapsing under its own weight. Investigators laid the evidence out carefully, step by step, not as an accusation but as an unavoidable sequence of facts. The medication. The internet searches. The altered documents. The money that had vanished and reappeared under different names. The message sent from Ethan's phone after he was already gone. Each piece alone was troubling. Together, they formed a pattern that left little room for coincidence. Claire's response was not what many expected. There was no dramatic breakdown, no confession poured out through tears. Instead, she became precise, almost legalistic. She corrected wording. She questioned timelines. She insisted on nuance. She spoke as if the right phrasing might still save her. But behind that control was fear. The nonprofit that once praised her now distanced itself publicly. Former colleagues released statements expressing shock and betrayal. Donors demanded answers. Accounts tied to her daughters were frozen, pulling Megan and Sophie into a situation they barely understood. For the first time, Claire was losing control of the narrative. Her daughters hired their own attorneys. They claimed they had trusted their mother completely, that she had told them the companies were temporary, harmless, just paperwork. Watching them realize how deeply they'd been used was painful for everyone involved. Ethan's children, meanwhile, were faced with a different kind of reckoning. They replayed memories with a new lens, the dinners where their father looked tired, the holidays where Claire insisted on handling drinks, the way she hovered whenever he mentioned feeling unwell. Grief gave way to anger. And anger hardened into resolve. When prosecutors formally outlined their case, the motive became clear. Claire's financial world was days away from exposure. Audits were turning into investigations. Investigations were turning into charges. Ethan, with his clean record and independent assets, was a liability she could not afford. His passing delayed questions. It created sympathy. It shifted attention. At least, it was supposed to. Instead, it became the very thing that unraveled her. As the trial date approached, Claire made a decision that surprised no one who understood the strength of the case against her. She entered a plea, one that avoided a spoken admission, but acknowledged that prosecutors had enough evidence to prove their claims beyond doubt. In court, she stood straight. She listened without expression as the details were read aloud. She did not look at Ethan's children. She barely glanced at her own daughters. The sentence was long. Long enough that there would be no return to the life she once curated so carefully. Long enough to ensure that every future milestone would pass without her presence. The judge spoke about trust. About how harm is deepest when it comes from someone closest. About choices made not in a moment of panic, but over time. When it was over, Claire was led away quietly. No speeches. No final statements. Just the sound of a door closing on the life she had constructed, and destroyed, piece by piece. Outside the courtroom, there were no cheers. No sense of victory. Only families standing apart, bound together by a loss that could never be undone. And the question that lingered in the cold air was not how it happened anymore. But how long it had been planned. The sentencing marked an ending in the legal sense, but for the families left behind, it was only the beginning of a long, uneven aftermath. Ethan's children returned to lives that no longer fit the shape they once had. Their father had been their anchor, the person they called for advice, for quiet reassurance, for help without judgment. His absence left a hollow space that practical matters could not fill. There were belongings to sort through, memories to navigate, and the slow realization that the man they trusted had spent his final weeks growing weaker in his own home. They struggled most with the ordinary details. The coffee mug still by the sink. The jacket still hanging by the door. The calendar with future plans written in his careful handwriting. Each item felt like evidence of time stolen. Claire's daughters faced a different kind of reckoning. Megan and Sophie were not charged with causing harm, but the damage to their lives was deep and lasting. Their names had been tied to shell companies. Their signatures appeared on documents they barely remembered signing. They learned, piece by piece, how their mother had used their trust as a shield. Public sympathy did not come easily. Strangers saw their last name and made assumptions. Former friends kept their distance. Careers stalled as background checks raised quiet red flags. Even after investigators confirmed they had not understood what they were part of, the association lingered. Privately, they grieved a mother who was still alive, but unreachable in every way that mattered. Visits were tense. Conversations careful. Questions went unanswered. Apologies, when offered, felt incomplete. The woman who raised them had not only destroyed her own future, but had dragged them into the wreckage. The community, once united in admiration, grew subdued. The non-profit shut its doors. Programs were dissolved. Families who had relied on its support were forced to look elsewhere. Trust, once broken, proved hard to rebuild. People asked how something so carefully hidden could exist for so long. The answer, unsettling in its simplicity, was that Claire had understood people. She knew how much they wanted to believe. How generosity disarmed suspicion. How confidence passed for honesty. And Ethan had believed. In the quiet that followed the headlines, his children focused on preserving who he truly was, not the final chapter, but the lifetime that came before it. They spoke of his work ethic, his consistency, his kindness without performance. They refused to let his story be defined only by the way it ended. For Claire, time moved differently now. Days measured by routine. By locked doors and counted steps. The persona she had built, leader, philanthropist, admired figure, had no value in a place where appearances meant nothing. What remained was consequence. And the knowledge that every choice she made to protect herself had cost her everything she once claimed to love. The lake froze again the following winter, smooth and silent. But for those left behind, nothing ever felt that still again. In the months that followed, the case slowly faded from the headlines, but it never truly faded from the people who lived inside it. Ethan's children learned that grief does not move in a straight line. Some days felt manageable, almost calm. Others arrived without warning, heavy and disorienting. They found themselves grieving twice, once for the father they lost, and again for the certainty they once had about the world. Trust, they realized, was fragile. Even a lifetime of doing everything right could be undone by one person's hidden choices. They held on to small rituals to keep Ethan close. Early mornings. Simple routines. Quiet acts of kindness done without recognition, things he would have done without thinking. In those moments, they felt him most clearly, not as a victim, but as the man he had always been. Claire's daughters faced a future reshaped by truth. Therapy sessions replaced denial. Distance replaced loyalty. They were forced to separate the mother they loved from the person the evidence revealed. Some questions never received answers. Some never would. What haunted them most was not only what their mother had done, but how calmly she had done it. How methodically she had planned. How easily she had justified each step as necessary, temporary, unavoidable. In the end, that was the most unsettling lesson of all. This was not chaos. It was calculation. Claire had believed she could manage every outcome the way she managed public perception, adjusting details, rewriting documents, controlling the story. She had underestimated the one thing she could not reshape, the truth. It surfaced slowly, patiently, and without emotion. Inside prison walls, there were no fundraisers, no applause, no carefully framed photographs. Only time. And time does not admire anyone. The lake where Ethan disappeared returned to its quiet rhythm. Ice melted. Boats returned. Life moved on for those who hadn't been changed by what happened there. But for those who had, the water would always carry a different meaning, a reminder of how easily trust can be used as a weapon. Ethan's story did not end on that boat. It lived on in the lives he touched, in the values he passed down, and in the hard truth that goodness does not guarantee safety, but it does leave something worth remembering. And Claire's story, stripped of polish and praise, became something far simpler. A reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden behind the most convincing smiles.